They sense the emotional detachment before you ever say a word, because avoidants are not blind to emotional energy. They are hypersensitive to it. Long before conversations change, before texts shorten, before distance becomes visible, they feel the internal shift in you. Your nervous system calms. Your need to explain fades. Your emotional availability no longer leaks through every interaction, and that quiet change unsettles them more than confrontation ever could. You stop reaching, not out of strategy, but out of genuine emotional closure. That is the moment the avoidant begins to notice something is different, even if they cannot name it. Avoidants are wired to detect emotional pursuit because it has always been the axis of their relational control. When you loved deeply, your concern, your checking in, your attempts to repair, your emotional labor became familiar signals. Those signals told them, I matter. I am safe to remain distant. When those signals disappear, their internal alarm activates. They may not consciously admit it, but the absence of your emotional pull creates discomfort. It forces them to face something they are not trained to handle. Emotional neutrality. You are no longer leaning in, and that changes the power dynamic completely. What unsettles them most is that your detachment doesn't feel angry. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels peaceful. There is no resentment leaking through your tone, no hidden plea, no emotional charge. And for an avoidant, peace is confusing. They expect emotional intensity, either pursuit or conflict, because both still connect you to them. Peace signals independence. It says your emotional center has returned to yourself. That realization hits them quietly but deeply. They may start replaying interactions in their mind, searching for the moment things shifted. Did you stop asking questions? Did you stop reacting to their silence? Did you stop explaining yourself? These small changes register as loss of influence. Avoidants often equate love with availability, not intimacy. So when your availability disappears, they interpret it as emotional withdrawal, even if the connection technically still exists. This is why they often sense it before you do. You may simply feel tired, grounded, or done. They feel threatened. Your nervous system no longer mirrors theirs. You are no longer emotionally dysregulated by their distance. That emotional independence disrupts the unconscious contract of the relationship. They didn't change, but you did. And that is what they notice. Avoidants rely heavily on emotional contrast. Your previous longing made their distance feel safe. Your calm now makes their distance feel exposed. They begin to wonder if they miscalculated, if they waited too long, if something irreversible has occurred. Not because they suddenly understand love, but because they feel the loss of emotional control. Even if they say nothing, their behavior shifts. They may hover energetically. They may watch your social cues more closely. They may test lightly just to see if the old emotional access is still there. All of this begins the moment they sense you no longer love in the same way. You didn't announce your departure. You didn't demand change. You simply stopped feeding the dynamic. And for an avoidant, that silent shift speaks louder than any goodbye ever could. They re-enter subtly to check if they still matter because avoidants are masters of quiet testing. Unlike those who confront directly, they rarely announce their return with clarity or declaration. Instead, they choose small gestures, small breadcrumbs, designed to gauge your emotional engagement without exposing themselves to vulnerability. A casual text, a brief like on a social post, a bye, fleeting comment. They watch and wait for your reaction. These actions are not about reconnecting in any meaningful way. They are about measurement. They want to know if the emotional connection still exists, if your attention is still theirs to draw, if your care can still be triggered with minimal effort. This subtle re-entry is a carefully calculated way to test your boundaries while remaining in control. The avoidance strategy is grounded in their fear of being too open, too exposed, too dependent. They know that a direct approach risks rejection, confrontation, or demands for intimacy that they are not prepared to meet. So they choose indirect approaches. Every small contact is a probe, an experiment, a way of assessing if you have moved on entirely or if traces of attachment still linger. They study your responses with precision. A delayed reply, a neutral tone, or the absence of curiosity signals to them that the emotional bond may have weakened permanently. A warm or engaged response, on the other hand, suggests that they can still elicit attention, that the dynamic of pursuit and distance can be maintained. Avoidants are also testing themselves in this process. They are asking silently, do I still have influence over this person? Do I still matter? Am I still a presence in their emotional world? Their subtle approach allows them to gather information without fully exposing themselves to emotional risk. They want reassurance that their absence is still felt, that their occasional attention can still create an impact. The more indirect their methods, the safer they feel in assessing these truths. These actions may appear innocuous or accidental to the outside observer, but to someone who has experienced avoidant patterns, they are immediately recognizable. The timing, the restraint, the lack of follow through all indicate that these gestures are not casual, hey, or deliberate. It is a way to reclaim a sense of relevance without committing to connection. They are seeking evidence that you care enough to respond without having to offer any vulnerability in return. This subtle reentry also tests the strength of your independence. If you respond eagerly, if your energy is still tethered to them, it validates the old dynamic and gives them a sense of control. If you respond minimally or not at all, it forces them to confront the reality that your emotional life no longer revolves around them. That can create internal discomfort, sometimes even panic, because the emotional leverage they relied upon has been weakened or lost. Ultimately, the avoidance subtle reentry is never about rekindling intimacy in the traditional sense. It is a calculated measurement of their lingering relevance and your emotional availability. They watch, they wait, they assess, and they measure. Every small gesture is a probe into the emotional terrain you have created in their absence. They are testing not just whether you still care, but whether the old patterns that fed their avoidance can still exist, or if your independence has finally set you free. They trigger old patterns to see if you'll chase again, because avoidants live in a world defined by emotional rhythm, and they are acutely aware of the cycles that once governed your connection. When they realize that you are no longer emotionally invested in the same way, their instinct is not always to confront or to walk away. Sometimes it is to recreate the familiar dynamics that once drew you toward them. This can appear as a sudden withdrawal, a cold shoulder, or even a return to behaviors that frustrated you before. The purpose is subtle but powerful. They want to test whether your attachment is still active, whether the patterns that kept the relationship alive and often unbalanced can still be triggered. Avoidants thrive on predictability within unpredictability. The old patterns of pursuit and retreat were familiar, even comforting, because they provided a sense of control over the emotional climate. When you no longer respond the way you once did, it threatens that equilibrium. By triggering behaviors that once elicited strong reactions, they are essentially running a test. They want to see if the emotional dynamics that once gave them leverage and reassurance are still operational. It is not conscious cruelty, it is an instinctual way to gauge their place in your emotional world. These triggers can take many forms. They may act distant after a period of closeness, knowing that your instinct may be to reach out, explain, or chase. They may initiate conflict or subtly provoke insecurity, testing whether old anxieties and patterns can be stirred. Every small action is designed to measure the response without overtly committing themselves to clarity or accountability. They are watching your behavior more than your words, because avoidants understand that declarations of love or detachment are less revealing than actions over time. The key to this dynamic is that avoidants do not need a verbal confirmation. They need evidence in real time. If you chase, if you call, if you react emotionally, they see that the old cycle can still function. It validates the familiar script of distance and pursuit, giving them a sense of emotional predictability and safety. If you do not chase, if you maintain calm and independence, it disrupts the script entirely. That disruption can be alarming because it forces them to confront something they rarely face, that their influence over your emotional world may have ended. In this process, they are testing boundaries as well. By triggering familiar behaviors, they measure not just your attachment, but your resilience. Will you fall back into old habits? Will you compromise your peace for the sake of connection? Or will you remain grounded, showing that your emotional center no longer orbits around them? The responses to these triggers are far more informative to an avoidant than any words could be because they reveal the depth of change that has taken place. Ultimately, triggering old patterns is less about reconciliation and more about assessment. It is a calculated way for an avoidant to understand the current state of your emotional engagement. They are probing, observing, and analyzing, not necessarily seeking to repair the bond, but to gauge whether the dynamic that once defined your relationship can still exist. Your response, calm or reactive, gives them insight into the reality they often fear the most, that you have moved on emotionally and energetically from the cycles that once bound you together. They create artificial crises to measure your reaction, because avoidants are profoundly uncomfortable with emotional truth that cannot be controlled. When they sense that you no longer love them in the same way, the absence of your pursuit and the calm in your presence becomes a mirror they are not used to facing. They are accustomed to relationships being driven by tension, anxiety, and emotional imbalance because those dynamics allowed them to remain distant without losing connection. When your detachment replaces emotional turbulence, they feel the need to manufacture disturbances, not to harm you, but to test whether your attachment and emotional reactivity still exist. These artificial crises are carefully constructed to observe your response without fully exposing themselves to vulnerability. These manufactured dramas can take many forms. They may exaggerate minor inconveniences, stir conflicts that never existed, or act in ways that seem unpredictable or confusing. The goal is to create a scenario where your old emotional patterns could emerge: an upset, a chase, a defensive explanation, so they can assess whether your care is still conditional on their actions. Avoidants rarely seek resolution in these moments. Resolution would require them to step into emotional vulnerability, something they are typically not comfortable with. Instead, they are watching and measuring. Your reaction becomes a litmus test for the residual pull of your emotions toward them. Avoidants rely heavily on emotional contrast. When your calm and independence replaces prior anxiety and pursuit, they feel a loss of control. They have become accustomed to relationships being a delicate balance of their distance and your engagement. By creating a small crisis, they simulate the emotional intensity they once elicited naturally. They want to see if the old patterns, your energy being drawn into their orbit, can still be triggered. They are not always conscious of the deeper motives. Often it is instinctual, a survival strategy for their emotional comfort. These crises also reveal much about their own fears. They are testing not only you, but themselves. Will you react with old anxieties that make them feel needed? Will you bend or compromise for the sake of the relationship? Or will your emotional independence remain steadfast, unshaken by the disturbance they created? The response they observe informs their internal narrative about the relationship's current state and whether it aligns with the dynamic they understood for so long. Even the smallest crisis, like a sudden change in tone, a delayed response, or ambiguous messaging, serves as a test. They are scanning for emotional triggers that reveal whether the connection still holds sway over you. If you respond with calm, boundaries, or neutrality, it shatters the expectation they rely upon, that their actions can control or elicit a reaction. That realization can be unsettling because it forces them to acknowledge that the emotional leverage they once held may no longer exist. Ultimately, these artificial crises are not about resolution or reconciliation. They are tools of observation, subtle experiments In emotional measurement, avoidants create them to see if the patterns that once defined the relationship can still function, and to gauge your emotional independence. Your reaction, or lack thereof, is the proof they are seeking when peace replaces pursuit. When calm replaces reaction, they are confronted with the undeniable truth. Your heart is no longer tethered, and their tests no longer hold power over your emotional world. They test your boundaries, not your words, because avoidants understand that declarations of love or loyalty are easily made but rarely trusted. In their world, actions speak louder than intentions, and behavior reveals the truths that words often conceal. When they sense that you no longer carry the same emotional energy toward them, they begin to probe subtly and persistently to determine whether your independence is genuine or if old patterns can still be reactivated. These tests are rarely overt. They are quiet, calculated, and designed to push without provoking outright confrontation. They want to see if your self respect holds firm, if your emotional limits remain intact, and whether the calm detachment you now embody is enduring or fragile. Avoidants rarely rely on verbal confirmation because words are unreliable signals. They have learned that people can say they are fine, they can claim they are unaffected, but their actions tell the real story. When they begin testing boundaries, they are essentially asking, will this person's emotional center bend back toward me, or will it stay firm? They may cross lines that were once sacred, test your patience with subtle provocations, or introduce scenarios where old insecurities could be triggered. Every response you give, every boundary you hold, or relax becomes a measure of your current emotional state. They are looking for evidence that your independence is authentic, that your energy is no longer entangled in the dynamic that once defined your connection. This boundary testing can manifest in many ways. They may invade your personal space emotionally, asking questions or making statements designed to elicit a reaction. They may flirt with old patterns, such as teasing or passive aggressive comments, to see if they still hold influence. Even indirect behaviors like checking your availability, commenting on your life, or introducing ambiguity serve the same purpose. They measure the strength of your emotional autonomy. The avoidant watches carefully, noting whether you respond with composure or whether old habits resurface, revealing residual attachment. What makes these tests so revealing is that avoidants are highly attuned to subtle shifts in behavior. Your calmness, your consistency, and your ability to enforce boundaries without guilt or apology signals to them that your emotional growth is real. Conversely, hesitation, emotional reactivity, or compromise under pressure can suggest that the old dynamics are still in play. They do not simply want reassurance of love, they want proof of transformation. The way you maintain yourself under quiet pressure tells them whether the relationship is still bound by dependence or has entered a space of mutual respect and independence. By testing boundaries, they also confront their own limitations. Avoidants are uncomfortable with vulnerability and fear being exposed to someone who cannot be controlled. When they push, they are often probing their own comfort level, seeing whether you can remain emotionally sovereign even as they introduce uncertainty. Your ability to maintain firm, respectful boundaries challenges their sense of security and forces them to reckon with the reality that your love or care cannot be compelled or manipulated. Ultimately, avoidants test boundaries because behavior is the language they trust. Words may be empty, but consistent action reveals truth. When you hold your ground, respond with dignity, and honor your independence, you communicate far more than any declaration of love ever could. Your boundaries become the evidence they cannot ignore, the proof that your emotional life is no longer dictated by their patterns, and the undeniable message that your peace and autonomy are yours alone. They panic internally when your peace doesn't break because avoidants are profoundly uncomfortable with emotional independence that cannot be managed or manipulated. Throughout the relationship, they have relied on a certain rhythm: the push and pull, the chase and retreat, the subtle emotional levers that kept you tethered to them even when they were distant. When you stop reacting When your energy no longer orbits around their presence, it triggers an internal alarm they are often ill equipped to handle. This is not about logic or conscious thought. It is a visceral reaction, a nervous system response to the loss of influence over someone whose attachment they once depended on, even unconsciously. Avoidants are used to emotional turbulence because it keeps the balance in their favor. Your old patterns, the worry, the pursuit, the attempts to explain, the anxious calls or messages, were familiar, predictable, and comfortable in a paradoxical way. They allow the avoidant to remain emotionally distant while still ensuring that connection remained intact. When you no longer engage in these patterns, they experience what can only be described as panic. The unsettling realization that, at their usual mechanisms no longer work, they can no longer test, provoke, or withdraw to elicit a response. Your calm is impenetrable, your boundaries are firm, your energy is no longer invested in them. This internal panic often manifests subtly at first. They may feel an inexplicable tension, a sudden restlessness, or intrusive thoughts about you. They might replay past interactions in their mind, wondering if something irreversible has changed, questioning whether your absence of reaction is temporary or permanent. They may attempt to regain a sense of control by testing you in small ways, checking in indirectly, stirring minor confusion, or reintroducing old dynamics to see if any residual attachment can be awakened. But when your peace remains unshaken, their panic intensifies because it contradicts everything they've relied upon, the predictable emotional responses that once defined the relationship. Avoidants rarely admit this panic outwardly. They may mask it with indifference, humor, or even aloofness. Internally, however, the lack of emotional reaction from you is profoundly destabilizing. It forces them to confront a truth they often avoid, that they no longer hold the power they once assumed they did. Your independence becomes a mirror reflecting their own vulnerabilities, their own reliance on control, and their inability to force attachment. It is a confrontation with their own limitations, and for someone wired to avoid emotional exposure, this is deeply unsettling. The more they attempt to provoke a reaction and fail, the more the panic grows. It is not merely about missing you, it is about losing the influence and reassurance they once derived from your emotional responses. Your unwavering calm, your consistent boundaries, and your visible peace communicate something they cannot alter. Your emotional world is no longer centered on them. This realized ion can create internal chaos because it challenges their assumptions about relationships, attachment, and control. Ultimately, the panic avoidants feel is a reflection of the truth they can no longer deny. Your heart, your mind, and your energy have moved beyond the old patterns that once bound you. They may test, provoke, or linger in subtle ways, but when your peace remains intact, they are forced to face the undeniable reality. You are emotionally sovereign, untethered, and free. Their internal panic is a testament to the power of your independence and the quiet strength that now defines your presence. Thank you for trusting me with your thoughts and ideas today. It's been a pleasure creating with you. Wishing you clarity, strength, and endless inspiration on your journey ahead.